Apple was investing, by 2015, $55 billion a year into China.
That Apple's entire supply chain rests on China. So they depend on China. That's where their bread is buttered.
So how exactly did the biggest tech company in the world turn America's key rival into the technological and military superpower it is today?
Apple has been captured by the CCP. About 90% of iPhones are being made in China. Apple knows that at any moment, Xi Jinping can literally kill the company. And Apple's not allowed to leave China and go somewhere else. But there's a twist to this story. Apple knew this all along. They're actually one of the biggest actors propping up the CCP. They've invested hundreds of billions into the regime, unlike any company has ever done before. $55 billion a year since 2015, to be exact. That's $500 billion total in just the last 10 years. More than 10 times President Biden's CHIPS Act or President Trump's Golden Dome initiative. It's a lot of money. You know what? Nothing says designed in California like $500 billion to Beijing. So let's try to understand how Apple got into this situation. Because in 1999, absolutely none of Apple's products were being made in China, and Apple wasn't selling any of its products there. 10 years later, virtually all of Apple's products were manufactured in China, and China was one of Apple's biggest markets. Now, I do have a serious disclaimer about this whole video. This is a sensitive topic for the CCP, and that's why mainstream media doesn't really talk about it. Actually, not a lot of people talk about this. So if you can please hit that like and subscribe button down below to help out the video, it really makes a difference. Especially since YouTube tends to favor mainstream content and doesn't always push sensitive videos, particularly those critical of the CCP. Remember, even a single like can go a long way in helping get this truth out. Okay, now let's get on with the video. This shift can be explained by what happened in 1996. Apple was nearly going bankrupt with a staggering $740 million loss that year. That's about $1.5 billion in today's money. The company actually hired a Chapter 11 lawyer because they were days away from failing to meet their payments. That sounds crazy knowing how successful Apple would become later, but back in the day, Apple was losing to its competitors in the computer business. In fact, this was the time when Apple sold off the bite of the apple that's missing from their logo. Yeah, true story. The market was flooded with PCs running on Windows. And because they all had pretty standard components, a new business model called electronics contract manufacturing, or outsourcing, emerged. Basically, PC companies ordered other companies to make the components and do the assembly for them. The same third-party contractors could supply the whole PC industry, creating huge economies of scale. And later, those third-party contractors moved abroad, where manufacturing wages were lower. But Apple was losing out because it didn't participate in outsourcing at first. Its designs were unique, and it was very difficult for other companies to make them, and Steve Jobs was a fan of making things in-house. So Apple manufactured most of its own products, including at the factory of Fremont in California. But Apple's prices got out of hand, and they knew that they had to change course. In 1980, it opened up its first foreign factory in Ireland. And in 1981, it built a factory in Singapore. That same year, Apple also placed orders with the American third-party contractor SCI Systems. However, Apple didn't fully commit. In 1991, the company opened a new Apple-owned factory in Colorado. This wasn't working, and after the near bankruptcy, the company shifted course. Steve Jobs said, "Think different," but maybe not that different. So after some brief experimentation in Mexico, Apple moved to Asia, like most American companies. But China wasn't in the picture at the time, because it was still a poor, underdeveloped communist country. South Korea, on the other hand, was already booming. So in the 90s, Apple signed contracts with South Korea's LG to make displays. Taiwan also got business deals with Apple, with companies like Quanta Computer and Inventec assembling Apple products abroad. Later, the Taiwanese chipmaker TSMC would become the exclusive chip supplier for Apple. But another Taiwanese company called Hunhai Precision Industry, or better known as Foxconn, would change the game completely. Foxconn was founded by a guy named Terry Gou, and he's a more important figure than most people realize. He would not only start one of the largest companies in the world, he would also build up the second largest economy in the world, namely China. Because in 1987, the Taiwanese government finally lifted martial law, allowing businessmen to trade with the mainland again. This happened 38 years after the Chinese Civil War had ended, separating the communist-ruled mainland from the nationalist-ruled island of Taiwan. At the same time, China opened up to the rest of the world, with free market reforms under Deng Xiaoping, and Terry Gou, also known as Uncle Terry, took advantage of this like no one else did. In the southeastern provinces of China, he set up tons of Foxconn factories. He built a whole city within Shenzhen, where up to 500,000 workers are employed. And scattered throughout China, there are many more Foxconn factories. Aside from Deng Xiaoping, there's no one who did more to develop China than Uncle Terry. He didn't just build a company, he speed-ran China's Industrial Revolution. And behind this rise of Foxconn is an even bigger company, namely Apple. In a matter of about 10 years, Apple would go from buying nothing from Foxconn to buying almost everything from the company. It all started in the year 2000, when Foxconn got its first contract to assemble iMac G3 models. This went incredibly well. So in 2003, when the iPod was selling like crazy, Foxconn also got a contract to make those. From 2005, Foxconn started working on the Mac Mini, and in 2006, they got contracts to make MacBooks. But the biggest deal of them all happened in 2007. Apple was about to launch the iPhone, and Foxconn decided to bet the house on this product. Lucky for them, the house had 40 stories and no labor laws. The company started to build massive iPhone factories because it believed the iPhone would be a success, and Foxconn was right. Over the following years, the iPhone would become Apple's biggest product by far, accounting for more than half of the company's revenue. Nowadays, Apple is more of a smartphone company than a computer company, and Foxconn capitalized on this fully, getting a near monopoly on manufacturing iPhones for Apple. Now, it's fair to say that Terry Gou is an incredible businessman with a very well thought-out strategy, but there's something fishy about this story. You see, the Chinese government helped Foxconn a lot, and by a lot I mean tax exemptions, loose regulations, cheap loans from state banks, free land, and even investing on the company's behalf. And the most eyebrow-raising fact of all is that the CCP allowed Foxconn to exploit Chinese workers. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of workers moved from the countryside to the cities in order to work in Foxconn's factories. And there were no human rights or labor laws at all. In the early days, workers were paid 50 cents an hour. And when the employees talked or laughed during work, they got huge penalties. They had to work every day, and shifts were 12 hours or more. When they were finished with work, they had to sleep in makeshift camps next to the factories. There were 8 to 12 people per room, and conditions were very poor. When the stories came out of how iPhones were being made, this would come back to haunt Apple. But going back to the CCP, this was a very strange strategy. Why would they allow a Taiwanese company to exploit their workers to make products for an American company? And why would they give this Taiwanese company all the resources and support it pleased? While economic growth was definitely an incentive, it wasn't the only reason. The real motivating factor for the CCP was this: China tried to make a deal Apple just couldn't refuse. And when Apple was fully dependent on China, the CCP would then use one of the most innovative and successful companies in the world to its own advantage. Long story short, the strategy worked, and Apple completely surrendered. And now not a single one of their products can't be traced back to China. And who can blame the company? With Foxconn, Apple couldn't wish for a better manufacturing partner. The model of outsourcing to China seemed to be working for all the parties involved. Well, except for the workers, of course. China's GDP grew a ton due to Apple. Foxconn's revenues shot up like crazy, and Apple became one of the biggest, most profitable companies in the world. And after 2010, China was not only a manufacturing base anymore. Chinese consumers became more prosperous, and Apple began to sell huge amounts of products in China. iPhones became a status symbol in the country, even more than it was in the US. So by 2015, Apple's China revenue hit nearly $60 billion, 25% of its total business. In terms of growth, China has been one of Apple's most important markets in recent years. The craziest statistic is that in the second quarter of 2023, China briefly surpassed the US in terms of iPhone sales. It's safe to say that Apple wouldn't be a $3 trillion company today if it weren't for China. But the cracks have started to show in Apple's China strategy. Word started getting out there that Apple was complicit in terrible human rights abuses in China. There has been widespread reporting that Foxconn employs underage workers in so-called internships. There were also multiple worker suicides at Foxconn in 2010. Ever since, Foxconn has installed nets around the factory to prevent people from jumping to their death. Nothing says we care like surrounding your building with trampoline-grade netting. On top of that, there are reports that Foxconn uses slave labor of Uyghurs in Xinjiang to make Apple products. This is all terrible PR for Apple. The company responded with apologies, audits, and responsibility reports, but the problem isn't fixed entirely. That's because Foxconn's whole business model depends on low wages, which means low welfare and low human rights for its employees. as we've already covered, the Chinese authorities actually support this, because they treat factory workers almost as second-class citizens. That's because the Chinese government allows Apple and Foxconn to exploit its workers so that China can exploit Apple. But the big shift happened when Xi Jinping got in power in 2013. Just a day after he was inaugurated, the Chinese media started attacking Apple. They did this on Consumer Day, one of the last reminders of Chinese socialism. Basically, one company is called out and exposed on the state-run CCTV network for not adhering to socialist values. Western companies were getting more and more criticism, and in 2013, it was Apple's turn. The Chinese state media said that Apple gave Chinese consumers worse warranties than the rest of the world. Now, this wasn't true. The real problem was that many iPhones were sold by fake resellers who pretended to be Apple stores. So Apple issued a correction, but that was a bad idea. Over the following days, Apple was attacked from all sides by CCP media and officials. So eventually, Apple's new CEO, Tim Cook, caved. He offered his sincere apologies and said that he had immense respect for China. He later introduced a warranty policy in China that was superior to what American consumers could get. But this wasn't about warranty policies. Obviously, it was a sign that Xi Jinping would start upping the pressure on Apple. And Apple wasn't alone in this. Multinational corporations were being attacked on all sides. In 2014, at least 30 foreign companies were targeted by antitrust investigations in China. The American chipmaker Qualcomm was hit badly, and they were forced to pay a $1 billion fine to the CCP. They also had to start joint ventures in China, which is worse than it sounds. Basically, Qualcomm could only do business in China if 50% of their operations were owned by a Chinese counterpart. This Chinese company would then be allowed to steal all their intellectual property, leave the partnership, and then copy their business. Other Western companies like Facebook and Google were already blacklisted back then in China, which was also not very promising for Apple. Tim Cook had to avoid this, and that's where he got creative. Apple started the Gang of Eight, which is an internal group at Apple solely dedicated to China and its relations with the CCP. It already sounds suspicious, but it gets even weirder. Because the group realized that Apple can only avoid trouble in China by helping the CCP achieve its goals, so that's what they did. The company started one of the largest transfers of manufacturing capability and engineering expertise in modern history. By 2015, Apple was investing $55 billion a year into China. Now, to point out how insane that is, let's compare it to some other investment programs. There's not really an equivalent in the business world. That's how enormous it is. So you have to look at governments. The CHIPS Act in the US, a supposedly once-in-a-generation investment into America, is $280 billion over 10 years. That's only $28 billion a year, not $55 billion a year. The Marshall Plan, basically what America did to rebuild 16 European countries after World War II, was $13 billion, or $130 billion in today's dollars, over 4 years. That's $32 billion a year. Still way less than what Apple spent in China. So the point is that Apple invested so much into China that it helped to build up the country into an economic superpower. The biggest factor is how many people Apple educated in China, which is where the majority of the investment has been spent on. In total, Apple has trained about 28 million Chinese people over the span of 25 years. Now, this figure also includes low-level factory workers, but a sizable portion are engineers. Apple has been sending some of America's best engineers to China to teach Chinese employees how to improve manufacturing. And now Apple has way more engineers in China than in the US. In 2017, Tim Cook said that in the US, you could have a meeting of tooling engineers, and I'm not sure we could fill the room. In China, you could fill multiple football fields. With its massive investments, Apple has become the single largest educator of Chinese engineers. The consequences of this are massive. This engineering knowledge didn't just stay with Apple employees. The Chinese Apple engineers went to Chinese universities and to Chinese companies where they taught and applied what they learned at Apple. And it's not just education. The other big factor is that Apple helps to build up and support a whole supply chain in China. Because it's not just Foxconn anymore. There's a whole list of components manufacturers in China. On Apple's 25-page supplier list, there are barely any suppliers that are not making components in China. The supply chain has increasingly gotten under the CCP's control, and it's part of what is called the red supply chain. But it's also the biggest reason why Apple can't leave, as we'll go into later. Now, this transfer of expertise and manufacturing capability did wonders for the Chinese economy. Without Apple's support, China certainly wouldn't be so close to America right now in terms of economic size. Because Apple made China into what it is today with its massive investments. But it's not even about GDP numbers. Alexander Hamilton, one of America's founding fathers, had very wise words to say about this. He said that Not only the wealth, but the independence and security of a country appear to be materially connected with the prosperity of manufacturers. In other words, manufacturing has a dual use. It doesn't only create jobs, but it's necessary for the military. If you're good at manufacturing, you can also make missiles, tanks, and drones. Although an iPhone is very distinct from military technology, the machines and the knowledge used are not that far apart either. The machines used to make iPhone casings can also be used to make missiles. Mass robotic assembly lines can also be used during wartime. And the logistics of making hundreds of millions of high-end products every year are pretty similar to the logistics of making military goods. But most importantly, Apple has trained tens of thousands of engineers in China, and they can make advanced military hardware. That's exactly what Xi Jinping wanted all along. In 2015, he launched the Made in China 2025 initiative. With his strategic manufacturing goals, he wanted to become one of the most powerful actors in the world. 10 years later, we can say that Apple helped China a ton with this. As the communists often say, the capitalists will sell us the rope by which we will hang them. Over the following years, Apple would do more to please the CCP. In 2017, Apple removed all VPN apps from the App Store on Chinese devices. This helped the CCP to reinforce the Great Firewall of China. Without VPNs, Chinese internet users can't escape this firewall that keeps China shut off from the rest of the world. That same year, Apple removed the New York Times app from Chinese devices. It also began to store all data of Chinese Apple users in a Chinese data center owned by a state company. So much for Apple's strong commitment to user privacy. You know, the new Apple slogan should be, "Thou shalt not pass the Great Firewall." Later, podcast platforms were removed from China's App Store, as well as Quran and Bible reading apps. During the 2022 protests, the airdrop feature was limited to prevent information from spreading rapidly. More recently, Apple removed WhatsApp and Threads from the App Store in China. With all this evidence, it's pretty clear that Apple is selling out to the CCP. That's all very shocking coming from a US company. But the story is getting even crazier now, because the US and China have been getting in hot waters recently over trade, with President Trump trying to get manufacturing back to the US. And because of tariffs, there are real incentives for Apple to come back. At the time of making this video, Trump is threatening to put a 25% tariff on foreign-made iPhones. There's also a growing geopolitical risk for Apple. When the US and China actually get into a conflict over something like Taiwan, Apple is done for. China could weaponize its control over Apple, removing its export license and leaving one of America's biggest companies to go bankrupt. Although this will be painful for China as well, the psychological and financial damage to the US will be well worth it for Beijing. Also, Apple is 100% reliant on TSMC in Taiwan for its chips, making the situation even more complicated. A war over Taiwan will end Apple one way or the other. To avoid these geopolitical risks, Apple wants to move to India and Vietnam for manual labor, taking advantage of cheap labor while diversifying away from China. By the end of 2026, Apple wants most of its iPhones sold in the US to be made in India. Last March, shipments of iPhones from India to the US reached a record 600 tons, worth $2 billion. Apple's contractors in India, namely Tata and Foxconn, are already rapidly expanding production in the country. Although this is good for PR and for avoiding tariffs, it doesn't actually help much. Assembly is only the final step in Apple's supply chain, and it's one of the easiest steps to move, so assembling in India and Vietnam doesn't solve Apple's China dependency at all. Meanwhile, the question is whether China will allow Apple to leave. Right now, Apple has about $47 billion worth of property, plants, and equipment, and most of it is located in China. Basically, it's owned by Apple, but used by Apple's third-party contractors. Especially the machines are a big deal, because they're designed by Apple itself to make the phones, laptops, and computers. But China isn't letting go of these machines. It's delaying or outright sabotaging shipments of Apple's machines out of the country. Apple owns the machines, but China owns the exit door. What makes the situation even more complicated is that Apple trained and educated millions of workers and thousands of engineers in China. They won't move to India or Vietnam, and it will be very hard and expensive to train new people in those countries. Also, when Apple leaves, there's a real risk that China will steal intellectual property. There have already been various stories of Chinese employees stealing trade secrets from Apple. Chinese competitors like Huawei have probably copied a few things here and there, and they've certainly benefited from the supply chain Apple has built up in China, sourcing components from the same local suppliers. But if Apple is going to leave, China might as well go nuclear and just copy everything. Now, I would love to end the video on a positive note. Apple recently announced that it's going to invest $500 billion into the US over the next 4 years. But unfortunately, that's also a PR stunt. Because if you look closely at Apple's announcement, they're only going to create 20,000 jobs in the US. $25 million per employee doesn't seem like a good ratio. And with 20,000 new employees, Apple is obviously not moving its production from China to the US. There are big promises to build a new factory in Houston, Texas, to expand manufacturing in Arizona, and to start an American manufacturing academy. But most of the money is probably going to go to things like data centers and computing, if it's spent at all. If we look at Tim Cook's past promises, we can only be skeptical. In 2021, he promised to invest $43 billion over 5 years into the US to create 20,000 jobs. In 2018, he promised to invest $350 billion over 5 years, also to create 20,000 jobs, because we want to help America. Apple seems to make the same promise every time a new US president is concerned about China. And they're not very creative either, because they promise the same 20,000 jobs every single time. I mean, at this rate, the only thing Apple will be manufacturing in America is announcements. But if we put ourselves in Apple's shoes, is it even possible to move to the US? American manufacturing workers earn 10 to 30 times higher wages than those in China. And where are you even going to find hundreds of thousands of manufacturing employees in America? On top of that, it would take years to build the manufacturing infrastructure and supply chain in the United States. Educating all of the engineers in the US would also take a long time. Now, robotics are getting more and more advanced by the day, so maybe Apple won't need a lot of people anymore, allowing the company to move manufacturing back home again. But for now, it would make more sense to move manufacturing to countries like India and Vietnam, not just for assembly, but for the whole supply chain. What Apple is not going to tell people is that this will take years, if not decades, and that Apple might be too late already. Because for now, and for the foreseeable future, Apple has a massive China problem. Now, this video was born out of Patrick McGee's new book, Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company. If you guys are interested in more details about how China took over Apple, definitely grab a copy of the book. And if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit the like and subscribe button and share this video with your House representative or your senator. Apple has a habit of making big promises to help American manufacturing without actually fulfilling any promises.